Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, settle down into whatever pillow configuration currently feels spiritually correct, and let your brain quietly clock out for the evening. Tonight, we're drifting far, far from the modern world. No emails, no notifications, no existential dread about your unread to-do list. Just a slow glide into the frustrating, exhausting, and occasionally absurd universe of ancient Chinese scholars. Because if you've ever thought, I could totally ace school if I lived back then, well, no. No, you would not. You would crumble like a soggy rice cake. But don't worry, everyone else did too. So let's float into that world. A world where your entire existence depended on how well you could write poems on command, quote obscure Confucian lines from texts that had more commentaries than sense, and pretend your calligraphy had a deep moral essence instead of looking like the panicked scrawl of someone who hadn't slept since last dynasty. And yes, we're going to take our time. We're going to wander through this universe at a calm, steady pace, the way an exhausted scholar tiptoes past the exam hall, hoping the invigilators don't smell his fear. So breathe, relax, and let's drift into the dusty, ink-splattered realm of men who willingly spent their lives memorizing books the length of several phone directories, because apparently that was the ancient Chinese version of job security. Let's begin. So imagine waking up in ancient China. Maybe the Tang dynasty, maybe the Song. Somehow you've reincarnated without the courtesy of modern literacy apps or caffeine. You inhale, stretch, and think you're about to seize the day. Then you remember. Oh yeah, you're a scholar in training. Which basically means you're about to bury yourself in a mountain of bamboo slips, inkstones, and philosophical ramblings written by men who lived centuries before streaming services were invented. And all of it, every last line, needs to be memorized. Not understood, not appreciated, just memorized. Word for word, tone mark for tone mark. Because the Imperial Examiners have the emotional range of a stone and will absolutely fail you for putting a comma where the original text probably never had one. But let's step back a little. Before the panic studying, before the sunken eyes and ink-stained sleeves, you have to understand why this whole scholarly life existed in the first place. Ancient Chinese society was, how do we put this gently, enthusiastically obsessed with the idea that the world functioned according to moral order. Everything, from your haircut to whether it rained too much that year, was somehow connected to virtue, cosmic harmony, and how well your emperor behaved at ancestral ceremonies. And in the middle of all this, the scholars. Scholars were the ones who were supposed to bring order, wisdom, and proper conduct. In theory, they were the intellectual backbone of society. In practice, they were sleep-deprived nerds arguing in tiny brushstrokes about whether Confucius meant benevolence or benevolent benevolence. And yes, those were considered different things. Naturally. But here's the twist. Being a scholar wasn't just a hobby. It wasn't something you did for fun. It was the only respectable path if you weren't born rich, titled, or lucky enough to have an uncle in the imperial court. Becoming a scholar and passing the imperial exams was your ticket to the social ladder. Like getting a government job today. Except instead of taking a simple test, you took one that made the bar exam look like a warm-up Sudoku. Let's float into this childhood a bit. Because your misery as a scholar didn't start at adulthood. It started basically the day you existed. Most boys in scholarly families began learning characters as soon as they could hold a brush without eating the bristles. At the age of 3, some kids could already recite the 3-character classic, which was essentially a rhyming textbook designed to brainwash children into being model Confucian citizens. Imagine being a toddler, barely understanding language, and someone is already drilling into your head. People at birth are naturally good. You're not even potty trained, but sure, let's start with moral philosophy. By age 6 or 7, your day looked something like this. Wake up early, bow respectfully to your parents, wash your face in whatever water wasn't frozen yet, and then spend the next 12 hours reading texts written in classical Chinese, which is, by the way, about as intuitive as learning calculus in Morse code. You copied characters until your wrists ached, you read commentaries on commentaries, you memorized ancient poems that your teacher insisted were essential to building character, because apparently character was stored directly in the rhyme schemes. Was this fun? Absolutely not. But this was your destiny, apparently. Now, to make things more entertaining, or painful, let's talk about the calligraphy situation. Calligraphy wasn't just handwriting. It was considered a direct reflection of your moral soul. If your strokes were messy, clearly your internal sense of balance was flawed. If your characters leaned, you probably lacked upright virtue. If your brush pressure was inconsistent, you were an unreliable person, probably not fit for government. So imagine your entire political future depending on whether your cursive flowed like a calm river, or looked like you slipped while sneezing. But it gets better. Because your father, who definitely fancied himself a part-time philosopher, would hover over your shoulder reminding you that the correct brushstroke technique was essential to cultivating the self. Meanwhile, you're 10 years old, holding a brush that weighs as much as your self-esteem, trying not to disappoint your ancestors. Let's float along to adolescence now. At this point, you've internalized the Confucian classics so thoroughly that they're basically living rent-free in your skull. You dream in Confucian aphorisms, you quote Mencius without meaning to. You've developed this subtle twitch that activates when someone mispronounces an idiom. And now, it's time for the exam hellscape to begin. The imperial exams weren't like modern tests. They were something else. Something that scholars still talk about today in the same tone you use to discuss traumatic group projects. These exams were held in multiple rounds, each designed to filter out anyone whose memory, writing style, or ability to flatter Confucian ideology wasn't up to standard. And the worst part, these exams didn't test practical knowledge. Oh no, that would be too normal. Instead, they tested your ability to interpret, rewrite, and elegantly compose essays about topics like discuss the nature of virtue in governance, or explain the deeper meaning behind this obscure sentence from the Book of Documents that no one has actually understood since the Zhou dynasty. Some candidates wrote beautifully. Others wrote desperately. A few wrote so nervously that their calligraphy devolved into something resembling the handwriting of a startled chicken. And the examiners, who spent days locked in rooms smelling faintly of exhaustion and ink fumes, would sift through thousands of papers until their eyes glazed over. But before even entering the exam hall, you had to undergo the ancient version of a security check. Candidates were inspected for hidden notes, illegal gulks, or, my personal favorite, secret cheat sheets sewn into their clothing. The examiners took cheating very seriously. Anyone caught was barred from future exams, disgraced, and opportunistically beaten. The seriousness of the whole process was so extreme that some candidates genuinely fainted during the inspection. So imagine standing in line, your stomach tied in knots, knowing that every pocket, every fold of your garment was about to be checked by officials who'd probably seen more sweaty scholars that day than they could emotionally handle. Then, the gates open, and you walk into the exam compound. These compounds were vast fields of tiny, cramped examination cells lined up like a grid of misery. Each cell was basically a stone or brick box, about the size of a small closet, containing a plank to sit on, another plank to write on, and absolutely nothing else. No comfort, no luxury, not even enough space to stretch your legs properly. You were locked in there for days at a time. Yes, days. You brought your own food, water, writing tools, ink, brushes, blankets, and whatever dignity you had left. Candidates slept sitting up, slumped over their desks like exhausted pigeons. Some people tied themselves to the wall so they wouldn't fall over and smear ink everywhere. It was a whole vibe. And while you're living this deeply unglamorous life, you're expected to produce essays of stunning elegance, moral insight, and poetic structure. Your handwriting has to be gorgeous. Your arguments have to be refined. Your quotations have to be flawless. And your mind has to stay calm, even though you haven't slept in 2 nights and your neighbor is quietly coughing like he's trying to summon the ancestors.
So, you've just failed your first Imperial exam. Welcome to the club. It's a large club, very prestigious. Membership includes most of the people who ever lived between the Han and Qing dynasties. You're in good company, though I'm sure that doesn't help as you trudge home, clutching your ink-stained sleeves, wondering if Confucius would judge you or quietly pat your shoulder. Let's drift into this return journey. It's slow, it's contemplative, you're exhausted. Your legs feel like noodles. And back at home, everyone tries very hard to pretend they're not disappointed. Your mother makes a comment like, "You tried your best, dear," which is ancient Chinese mom code for, "We believed in you because we had no other options." Your father, meanwhile, sits in the corner quoting Confucian lines about perseverance, while trying not to look like he regrets investing 17 years of tutoring money into your brain. And your little siblings run around outside, blissfully free of exam responsibilities for a few more years, until their turn comes and the whole cycle repeats. But of course, you don't give up. Because if you gave up, what would you even do? Become a farmer? Absolutely not. Open a shop? That's for people with business sense, something you, a scholar, do not have. Join the military? Let's not get dramatic. So naturally, you return to studying, like a weary hamster returning to its wheel. Because, well, what else is there? Let's float for a moment into the daily routine of a scholar in his 20s. You've survived childhood memorization drills. Your calligraphy has improved to the point where it only slightly resembles the handwriting of someone who's very stressed. You've developed opinions about the merits of various philosophical commentaries. Not that anyone cares, but it makes you feel alive. Your typical day looks something like this. Wake up early. Bow respectfully to your parents. Eat porridge that has the emotional energy of lukewarm hope. Then settle in for reading. Hours of reading. Texts like the Analects, the Book of Rites, the Book of Documents, the Book of Changes, the Mencius, and a whole galaxy of associated commentaries. These commentaries are written by men who apparently never heard of conciseness. Many wrote like they were paid by the metaphor, weaving sentences that spiraled into philosophical labyrinths. You copy passages until your fingers ache. You recite them until your voice goes hoarse. And through all this, you try to cultivate the serene, balanced, morally upright inner self that Confucianism demanded, even though your inner self mostly feels like a stressed-out dumpling. Around midday, you might take a break to stretch your legs or drink tea. Maybe you chat briefly with another scholar from the village, someone who's also deep into exam prep and who definitely has opinions about the correct interpretation of benevolence in governance. You listen politely, you nod, you pretend you're drifting into a philosophical coma. In the afternoon, you practice composition. Because it's not enough to memorize lines, you must also present them beautifully. Writing an eight-legged essay was like assembling an elegant puzzle with rules so specific that they'd make a modern editor cry. The structure was rigid, predictable, and yet bizarrely complex. You were expected to introduce the topic with refined brevity, discuss the classical background, distinguish between previous interpretations, present your own modestly humble position, weave in quotations like decorative ornaments, and conclude with the kind of moral flourish that made examiners nod in approving boredom. The goal wasn't originality. The goal was correctness, polite, safe, doctrinally aligned correctness. Creativity was something you kept far away, like a suspicious relative who might embarrass you at banquets. Let's drift into the social world of scholars, because it's fun to explore the human part of this otherwise sleep-deprived existence. Scholars weren't hermits. Well, most weren't. They had friends, they visited tea houses, they exchanged poems the way people today exchange memes, they argued about philosophy the way people now argue about whose opinion on the internet is wrong. But these friendships had a vibe, a mix of respect, competition, and mutual suffering. For example, two scholars might get together for a casual walk along the river, appreciating the scenery while lightly judging each other's footwear and debating the role of ritual in maintaining cosmic order. You know, normal friend stuff. Then one would produce a poem, on the spot, and the other would pretend to appreciate it while quietly planning an even better one to recite later. Scholars loved poetry competitions. They'd write poems about anything: storms, friends, loneliness, bad exam results, poorly cooked rice, the existential dread of studying, and the moon. Especially the moon. China has enough scholar-written moon poems to tile a palace. Sometimes these gatherings got emotional. A scholar would sigh dramatically about his lack of progress. Another would lament how cruel fate was. A third would confess that he'd seen the list of exam passers and recognized none of the names, which somehow made him feel even worse. And eventually, someone would quote an overused line from the Book of Changes, and everyone would nod solemnly. Even ancient scholars needed group therapy. Let's float forward to the moment when you reach your 30s. By this point, most scholars began questioning their life choices. You've now failed the Imperial exam enough times that you've memorized the crowd reactions at the results board. You've lost several years of youth to studying and are now developing chronic back pain. Your hairline is not thriving. Meanwhile, your parents quietly begin suggesting alternative options. Not actual alternatives, mind you, just gentle reminders that you should consider your future, which translates roughly to maybe pick something stable before we die of natural causes and disappointment. But you persist, because scholars were nothing if not stubborn. And the emotional stakes keep rising, because in ancient China, there was no upper age limit for exam candidates. Some men sat for the exam well into their 40s and 50s. A few rare champions managed to pass at astonishingly old ages and were celebrated as symbols of perseverance, or, depending on your interpretation, symbols of a tragic academic system that consumed entire lives. But here's where things get more interesting, because not all scholars relied solely on books. Some developed elaborate rituals to help with studying. A few examples. One scholar tied his hair to the rafters so he wouldn't doze off while reading. Another kept a bucket of cold water beside his desk and splashed his face whenever fatigue set in. One man, apparently very serious about efficiency, slept on a chair so he could wake up faster. And one particularly dramatic figure wrote inspirational notes on his own walls and sometimes on his own skin. You know, totally normal behavior. Let's gently drift into the idea of scholarly virtue. This is important because Confucian ideology prized the moral quality of the scholar above almost anything else. Scholars were expected to be paragons of filial piety, humility, self-control, righteousness, loyalty, and that special Confucian blend of benevolence that no one fully agreed on. Society expected scholars to be moral compasses, even when they were exhausted, broke, and just trying to memorize the correct number of commentaries for the spring and autumn annals. The result? Many scholars developed this calm, serene facade that masked a swirling interior of stress. They wrote poems about longing, uncertainty, and failure. They cultivated philosophical acceptance while quietly losing their minds. Let's float into exam attempt number 3, 4, and 5. You enter the compound again. Same cramped cell, same planks, same cold wind drifting through the cracks in the walls, same moment of wondering why you became a scholar instead of, say, a silkworm farmer. But this time, you've grown. You've learned strategy. You know what essay structures the examiners like. You know which commentaries they consider official. You know how to embed quotations so seamlessly that they appear spiritually uplifting rather than pretentious. You write with controlled confidence. You keep your strokes steady. You remind yourself that sleep is optional. You ignore the coughing man 3 cells over who sounds like he's about to ascend into the afterlife. And when the exam ends, you step outside again, blinking in the sun. People trickle out like ghosts. Some clutch their essays dramatically. Others simply look relieved to breathe fresh air again. You go home, you wait. And when the results are posted, your name is still not there. So you shrug, sigh, and head back to the study table. Because one thing about ancient Chinese scholars, they didn't quit easily. Mostly because they weren't allowed to, but still, it counts. Let's float into the emotional toll a little more, because that's where the real humanity sits. Scholars wrote countless letters and poems.
And let's glide back into that peaceful, slow, ink-scented world where your worth as a human being is measured primarily by how nicely you can write the character for virtue. Let's drift into something essential to the scholar identity: taste. Scholars were expected to cultivate elegance. Not wealth, not brawn, not political instincts, elegance. A refined, effortless aesthetic that suggested deep moral cultivation. Whether you had it or not determined how people judged your inner character. And this wasn't material elegance. Scholars weren't supposed to flaunt riches. That was for merchants who'd apparently traded their souls for silver. No, scholarly elegance was subtle. It hid inside habits, hobbies, handwriting, and even the way you arranged your desk. Your desk, by the way, had to contain a brush that showed you took calligraphy seriously, inkstone of appropriate modesty, carefully dried ink stick, preferably one with poetic provenance, paper you claimed to not care about but secretly obsessed over, a few scrolls placed just casually enough to look unplanned. Everything had to look natural, effortless, unaffected, which of course required immense effort. Scholars were basically the ancient Chinese equivalent of people who say, "Oh, this outfit?
I just threw it on, while fully knowing they coordinated everything down to the shoelaces. But elegance didn't stop at the desk. Scholars had tastes in everything: music, art, tea, gardens, philosophical arguments, moonlight. Yes, moonlight. Some scholars wrote entire essays ranking different sunsets they'd seen on long walks home from exam failures. This wasn't pretentious. This was considered character development. Let's float into gardens, because if a scholar didn't have a garden, he at least had strong opinions about them. Ancient Chinese scholar gardens were peaceful refuges, carefully curated to look wild and spontaneous, though every stone, plant, and water ripple was placed with mathematical precision. These gardens weren't about grandeur. They were about balancing nature and morality. A scholar might spend all morning adjusting a single rock until it felt spiritually aligned. And if a friend visited, he'd lead them through the garden as if every pebble had a deep backstory. And the friend, being polite, would pretend to understand. Scholarly garden tours usually went like this. This mossy stone represents resilience. That bent pine tree symbolizes enduring hardship. This pond is shallow, but in a contemplative way. That pavilion? I wrote a poem about it while recovering from my last exam failure. If you visited without showing proper appreciation, you risked losing all scholarly respectability. Let's slowly drift into another central pillar of scholar life, poetry. Because poetry wasn't a hobby. It was a survival skill. Scholars wrote poems the way modern people send texts, frequently, casually, and sometimes for emotional venting at 2 a.m. Every scholar had a personal collection of poems. Many had several. Some wrote poems every day. And the themes? The moon. Always the moon. Failing exams. Missing home while failing exams. Loneliness. Friendship. Longing. The inadequacy of one's own moral cultivation. Nature, but in a slightly sad way. Tea. Rain that reminded them of failure. Wind that reminded them of passing time. Mountain paths, symbolizing inner struggle. And also the moon again. There are thousands of poems about the moon. Enough to start a lunar museum. But poetry wasn't about originality. Scholars often reused themes, lines, metaphors, even entire poetic structures. The goal wasn't to be groundbreaking. The goal was to capture your inner moral refinement, display your sensitivity to nature, and subtly show off how well read you were. A scholar who couldn't write poetry? Socially doomed. Even if he memorized the classics, wrote decent essays, and passed the exams, if his poetry was mediocre, people would whisper things like, "Yes, he's competent, but does he truly feel anything?" Which is ancient Chinese for, "Bless his heart, he's a talentless pumpkin." All right, let's sink a little deeper into the quiet glow of the lanterns. We're floating into the Song Dynasty now, which is basically the era where scholars realized that life is suffering, and then someone carved that into a stele just to make sure future students would know it too. The Song Dynasty was the golden age of paperwork. People sometimes call it the Renaissance of China. And sure, porcelain got fancy, cities boomed, and people actually had restaurants with menus. But honestly, this is the dynasty where the imperial exams became a full-blown national sport. A slow, painful sport with no cheerleaders, only commentary from grumpy old Confucianists. Let's float into the life of a typical Song scholar, the guy who wakes up every morning hoping today will be the day he finally memorizes that one poem from the Book of Songs that keeps evading him like an unpaid tab. He's probably 23, but looks 37. He has dark circles under his eyes that could be described as artistically carved. He has a hairstyle that could be called, "I have not slept since last harvest." And he wears the expression of someone who can recite the analects but cannot remember the last time he felt joy. This is your average exam candidate. And now, let's gently follow him on a little journey. The journey through the local exam circuit, which is already stressful enough to make most people question their career choices. But scholars, no, they doubled down. Because, of course they did. The local exams, a soft beginning that wasn't soft at all. The first stage was the county-level exam. On paper, this was supposed to be simple, just a chance to prove you weren't completely illiterate. But the Song Dynasty had a lot of people, and everyone suddenly had opinions about Confucian virtue. So thousands of candidates would shuffle into a courtyard like anxious ducks. Officials would examine them like they were suspicious vegetables. And then everyone would be handed essay prompts. Things like, discuss the moral virtues of a Junzi who refrains from excessive self-interest with reference to the spring and autumn annals. It was basically, explain why being a good person is good, but make it literary and cite your sources. Oh, and don't forget, if your handwriting was ugly, immediate failure. They didn't care how brilliant you were. If your characters looked like a drunken squirrel drew them, they'd toss your exam aside like week-old tofu. No pressure. Once you passed the county-level exam, you moved on to the provincial exam, which was basically the same pain, but with more competitors, more officials, and more passive-aggressive commentary about your moral character. At each stage, the scholar had to write these perfectly structured essays that followed strict rules. If the essay structure was even slightly off, disqualified. If your arguments weren't orthodox enough, disqualified. If you accidentally implied the emperor was anything less than the shining moral axis of humanity, definitely disqualified. This was the warm-up, and already our scholar was losing hair. The provincial exam, where optimism goes to die. Next came the provincial exam, which only happened every 3 years. If you failed, you waited. You waited like someone waiting for their favorite shows next season, but instead of excitement, it was mostly resentment and vitamin deficiencies. These exams lasted 3 days and 2 nights inside little exam cells that were basically stone cubicles. Imagine a space so small you couldn't even lie down properly. Just sit, write, eat questionable food, and try not to panic. Many candidates brought special pillows designed to fold into tiny squares. Some brought candles made of compressed beans because real candles were too expensive. A few brought charms, talismans, or that one lucky inkstone from Grandma, the one she swore was blessed by a wandering monk, though it probably wasn't. Failure rates were around 99%. 1% success. 1%. This was basically the Dark Souls of academic life. Let's picture our scholar inside his exam cell. He sits down, takes a deep breath, and opens the exam paper. The first question is, naturally, interpret a moral dilemma from the Book of Rights and explain its relevance to statecraft. Include historical examples and cite classical commentary. Now, keep in mind, the Book of Rights is about as clear as mud. It's like reading an ancient instruction manual for a machine that doesn't exist anymore, written by people who assumed everyone in the future would be psychic. But our scholar tries. He writes until his hand cramps and his brush tip splits like an exhausted little broom. At some point he might whisper, "I should have become a merchant." But then he remembered merchants had low social status and he would never be allowed into polite conversation again, so he goes back to writing. By the end of day 3, his ink is thin, his handwriting shaky, and his essays are held together by sheer stubbornness. Will he pass? Probably not. But scholars kept trying because in ancient China, hope was renewable energy. The psychological toll, the original academic burnout. The exam system created a special, unique kind of depression, a kind that was widely accepted, socially normalized, and even praised. Family members would say, "Oh, he's losing weight and muttering about Confucius at dinner. He must be working very hard. How admirable." But the toll was enormous. Some scholars failed for 20 or 30 years. Some took the exam into old age. Some died still waiting for their breakthrough moment. There are actual records of scholars who had nervous breakdowns because they forgot a quote during the exam and convinced themselves their life was over. Imagine trying to comfort these guys. You'd say, "It's okay. Just try again in 3 years," which is the least comforting sentence ever spoken in the history of human encouragement. But this was the scholar's world, a world where anxiety was a daily meal, usually eaten with rice porridge. Let's float over to the capital, the metropolitan exam. If our scholar somehow defies the odds and passes provincial exams, he gets to go to the capital for the metropolitan exam. This is like going from local karaoke night to the national finals. Only, instead of singing, you're reciting Confucian morality until your spirit leaves your body. The capital was full of nervous scholars wandering around in their exam robes, looking like sleepwalking philosophers. The city's inns were packed. Tea houses overflowed with people trying to calm themselves down with jasmine tea, which definitely did not work. Officials would prevent cheating by searching everyone. And when I say searching, I mean searching. They checked clothing, shoes, hair, belts, pockets, even inside the ink holders, because cheating was everywhere. People smuggled notes inside hat linings. They wrote tiny characters on silk ribbons. One guy famously tattooed whole passages of classics on his torso. The Song Dynasty examiners said, "Yes, we will be checking the torso." It was a very dignified profession. Once inside the Capitol Exam Hall, scholars wrote even more essays. And these essays were expected to be masterpieces of clarity, orthodoxy, and poetic flair. This was the exam where the emperor might personally read the top papers. So if you messed up, congratulations, you had disappointed the Son of Heaven. No pressure. The final palace exam, the final boss. If the scholar passed both the provincial and the metropolitan exam, he was invited to the palace for the final examination, personally overseen by the emperor. By this point, scholars were emotionally numb. Many walked into the palace like ghosts, too tired to even be starstruck. This final exam wasn't even about ranking skill. It was about determining prestige. Everyone who made it this far would pass, but their ranking, top, middle, or bottom, could determine their bureaucratic destiny. The top score became the Drong Nuan, the champion scholar, a title so respected people wouldn't stop talking about it for generations. Families would brag endlessly. Yes, my ancestor was a Drong Yuan in the year so-and-so. And other families would sigh and think, "We're settling into the quieter corners of ancient China, the places where scholars went when their exam dreams had been shattered like a poorly fired porcelain bowl." You know the type. They studied for 15 years, failed 17 exams, and finally said something like, "Maybe enlightenment is easier." These were the scholars who retreated into mountains, into temples, into tiny huts with drafty windows and questionable roofing. And honestly, ancient China produced a lot of these guys. Let's glide over to some of the more famous or infamous cases. The scholar who gave up and invented hermit life. One of the most iconic figures in the tradition of "I'm done with society" was Tao Yuanming, also known as Tao Qian. He lived during the Eastern Jin dynasty, long before the Song exam mania reached its final boss stage, but he set the tone for what a certain type of scholar would do when life got too loud. They left. Tao Yuanming had a government job for a bit, but apparently the local magistrate he worked with was so unbearable that Tao quit rather dramatically. The story goes that he said he refused to bow for 5 pecks of rice, meaning he'd rather be poor than deal with petty bureaucratic nonsense. And honestly, respect. So Tao left the office, ignored his colleagues' shocked faces, walked home, and never returned. He spent the rest of his life tending his garden, drinking wine from questionable gourds, and writing some of the most peaceful poetry ever created. Imagine him looking out at a rice paddy at sunset, sipping fermented happiness and thinking, "Yep, this is better than paperwork." It was the ancient Chinese equivalent of quitting your corporate job to start a small tomato farm. A noble dream. Let's float over to the poets who were just done with everything. Ancient China had poets for every mood, but the scholar poets were a special breed.
They wanted to pass exams, but they also wanted to write long emotional pieces about moonlight and failed ambitions. And the moon was always involved. Always. You couldn't write Chinese poetry without mentioning the moon at least twice per stanza. It was basically a rule. Many of these scholar poets turned to alcohol after too many exam failures. Some wrote poems while crying into their cups. Some wrote poems to their cups. But their writing often became the emotional outlet for a lifetime of academic frustration. Take Meng Haoran, a Tang Dynasty scholar poet. He tried to become an official, failed spectacularly, and then spent his days wandering around mountains writing about how sad and tired he was. People look at his poems today and call them masterpieces of natural imagery. But if you read between the lines, you can hear the quiet voice of a man saying, "I studied for 20 years, and all I got was moss and existential despair." Then you have Su Dongpo, or Su Shi, one of the talented humans to ever hold a brush. Su passed the exams, because of course he did. He was a genius. But then he spent the rest of his life being exiled for his writing. He wasn't trying to be political. He was just a little too funny, a little too casual, a little too good at metaphors that hinted, subtly, that maybe the emperor wasn't always right. This is the problem with being funny in a system that takes itself very seriously. People start noticing. Su got exiled multiple times, usually to some far-off place where the coastal winds were strong and the amenities were limited to rice and more rice. But he remained cheerful, wrote essays about how delicious the local clams were, and painted landscapes that basically said, "Exile? Fine, I'll make soup." He became the patron saint of scholars who cope through creativity. But even he admitted somewhere in his writing, being a scholar is exhausting, which is an understatement of the millennium. The scholar who decided ghosts were easier than bureaucrats. There was also Pu Songling, writer of strange tales from a Chinese studio, who never passed the highest exams, but spent his entire life collecting ghost stories. Why? Well, after failing so many times, he probably thought ghosts were more relatable than officials. You can imagine him sitting there, sipping tea, telling someone, "Yes, I could rewrite my essay on filial piety again, or I could write about a fox spirit who steals men's souls," whichever feels less emotionally draining. Pu Songling spent decades listening to local gossip, folklore, and weird stories. He claimed people told him things because he had failed long enough to become unthreatening. Which is honestly iconic. When a scholar is no longer seen as competition, just as a harmless chronic storyteller, people open up. And Pu did what any tired, discouraged scholar might do. He leaned into it. He wrote thousands of stories. He technically didn't win the exam system, but he became one of the most famous writers in all of Chinese literary history. So, silver lining. Let's drift back to the exams themselves, the cheating Olympics. We've drifted around a lot of scholars who gave up and reinvented themselves, but let's return to the exam culture for a moment, because we haven't yet talked about one of its most creative aspects, cheating. Ancient Chinese scholars had some of the most advanced cheating techniques in world history. and exam officials spent decades trying and mostly failing to keep up. Let's glide through a few of the greatest hits. Miniature calligraphy, the art of writing with a brush the size of a hair. Some scholars wrote cheat sheets so tiny that archaeologists today still marvel at the handwriting. These were called fly-sized characters because they were literally the size of fly legs. Imagine writing entire chapters of Confucian texts on a strip of silk so small you needed to squint aggressively just to find the edge. This was done with special brushes made from kitten whiskers or newborn rabbit fur. I wish I weren't kidding. Officials eventually banned these brushes. Of course, scholars just invented smaller ones. The medical excuse strategy. Some candidates claimed they had medical conditions that required them to carry pills or powders. Inside these pills, rolled up cheat sheets. Officials eventually learned to crack the pills open. This resulted in many scholars frantically explaining, "No, sir, I swear, this is herbal medicine, definitely not a tiny copy of the doctrine of the mean." The disguised scholar. Every dynasty had at least one case where a family hired a genius to take the exam under their son's name. Sometimes the genius passed, and the family celebrated. Sometimes the genius got caught, and both he and the son suffered the consequences. There's a story about a boy so unprepared that when officials questioned him after suspecting a stand-in, he couldn't explain what the 5 classics were. He genuinely had no idea. He looked at the officials and said, "Are there really 5?" The room was silent for a long time. The tattooed textbook. As mentioned earlier, one scholar famously tattooed passages of Confucian classics onto his torso. It was an extreme method, painful, irreversible, and honestly quite dramatic. Officials caught him. They declared improper study habits, which is a very calm way of saying, "You ruined your torso for nothing." The exam system's internal rivalries, a calm, passive-aggressive battlefield. Now let's drift into the workplace environment that awaited successful scholars. The bureaucratic world in ancient China was full of factions: Confucian purists, reformist scholars, practical administrators, and the occasional philosopher who somehow wandered into government by mistake. Most of their disagreements were calm, polite, and deeply passive-aggressive. Officials wrote critiques of each other in language so refined that sometimes it took 3 readings to realize it was an insult. For example, someone might say, "His calligraphy is elegant, though his ideas are surprisingly simple," which is the bureaucratic equivalent of, "Nice handwriting, shame about your brain." These commentaries circulated for years. Some became classics of We've talked about exams, failures, poetic venting, hermit retreats, cheating techniques, and bureaucratic purgatory. But we haven't really touched yet on the subtle, persistent, existential exhaustion that most scholars carried like an invisible backpack. Let's float into that now. Morning life, or the ritual of waking slowly. A typical scholar would rise at dawn, or earlier if insomnia had claimed him overnight,
Insomnia was basically a feature of the job, not a bug. He'd stretch, mutter a brief apology to heaven for still being alive, and start the slow, deliberate ritual of making tea. The tea-making process was crucial, not just for refreshment, for morale, for ritual purity. Some scholars measure the temperature with an almost mystical precision, dipping a finger into the water to judge whether it was philosophically correct. Some would boil water 3 times because water remembered things, and maybe it remembered failure if not purified properly. Then came breakfast, a simple porridge, often seasoned with salt, or a few rice balls if money permitted. Some scholars were lucky enough to have a small family garden. Others relied on merchants whose rice was probably older than the last exam cycle. Breakfast was usually accompanied by a quiet reading of classical texts. Nothing heavy, just a line or two to gently remind oneself, yes, I am a scholar, and also probably doomed. Daily tasks, endless, gentle torture. After breakfast, the scholar moved to his daily duties. For exam-passed officials, this often meant a combination of clerical work, moral guidance, and bureaucratic hand-wringing. Checking local tax records, ensuring rice storage wasn't mismanaged, responding to petty complaints from villages, writing reports about reports, sometimes to submit to superiors who never read them. Each task was executed with quiet dignity, but also a simmering sense of futility. Because no matter how carefully the scholar calculated crop yields, measured river currents, or drafted official proclamations, human chaos persisted. A child tripped on a road, someone complained about a neighbor's fence, ducks wandered into a rice field, and the scholar? He recorded it all, carefully, with brushstrokes precise enough to make modern calligraphy teachers weep. This is where subtle despair became a lifestyle. The job was neither glamorous nor particularly dangerous. It was simply endless, like a soft, bureaucratic snow falling for decades, covering your sense of self in slow, silent layers. Lunch was a quiet meditation. Midday brought lunch, often just rice and pickled vegetables, sometimes fish, occasionally tofu. Many scholars ate in silence. Some recited poetry under their breath, quietly competing with invisible rivals from distant provinces. Others took walks in small gardens, contemplating the universe, the impermanence of life, or how unfair it was that they still had 2 more essays to write that afternoon. During lunch, gossip flowed. Political gossip, family gossip, sometimes rumors about exam corruption. But it was all polite, all quiet, and all soul-crushing in its gentle persistence. A scholar would nod thoughtfully and say, very interesting. How unfortunate. Which was ancient Chinese for, yes, I am dying inside, but quietly because that's how we do things. Afternoon, the endless cycle of writing. Afternoons were reserved for writing. Letters to superiors, reports for administration, poetry for emotional survival, essays for self-improvement, and occasionally, reminders to oneself that life might not be so bad, although mostly that was done in poetic metaphor. Some scholars developed a unique writing style, slow, meticulous, and slightly obsessive. Brushstrokes were carefully measured, ink was mixed to exact tones, paper was selected for texture, softness, and absorbency. Because nothing says inner turmoil like the perfect line of calligraphy. The writing process was often punctuated by sighs, small, gentle sighs, big, dramatic sighs, occasionally whispering to the moon, "O moon, why must you be so constant while I fail so frequently?" And if the moon didn't respond, well, that was okay too. The scholar had already memorized 1,000 poems addressing this very problem.
Evening, quiet reflection and subtle panic. Evening was when the scholar's internal dialogue grew loudest. Sleep was difficult because even the eyelids seemed to demand moral reflection. He would lie on a simple mat or bed, hands folded, perhaps murmuring quietly to himself, "Ah, another day survived. Another day failed. Another day written in ink and sighs." Often insomnia accompanied these reflections. The scholar would wake at odd hours, review texts in his mind, or quietly rewrite poems in his head. And even if he fell asleep, dreams were rarely restful. They involved vague, bureaucratic nightmares, misplaced brush, smudged calligraphy, forgotten classics. Sometimes exams appeared in dream form, gently whispering, "You have failed again." And yet he would wake, prepare tea, breathe slowly, and begin the process again, because that was the life of a scholar. The scholars who never stopped trying. Even the most exhausted scholars kept trying. There were stories of men passing their first provincial exam at age 50, men finally securing office in their 60s, even octogenarians writing essays with hands trembling from age, ink smudging across the page. The world expected perseverance, society praised resilience, families hoped for success. The scholar, meanwhile, just wanted to survive the next day. And some did. Not all, but enough to inspire legends. The moonlit philosophy of scholar existence. If you ask a scholar why they endure all this, they might answer, duty, moral cultivation, service to the state, the refinement of character, the eternal search for virtue. Or, more likely, because what else would I do? The mountain looks nice. The moon is calm. And that's really it. The scholar's life is a series of small, deliberate, slow-moving rituals. Endless effort, endless reflection, endless writing. A gentle cycle of hope, despair, poetry, and ink. It's calm. It's meditative. It's quietly, persistently exhausting. And that's precisely why you would not last a day. Conclusion. Floating away with the scholars. So here we are, gently drifting toward the edge of this tale. We have seen endless exams that span decades, subtle, passive-aggressive rivalries, bureaucratic purgatory, hermit poets and moonlit wanderers, elderly candidates who never stopped trying, poetry, gardens, tea, and existential reflection. All of it slowly, gently, beautifully exhausting. Being a scholar in ancient China wasn't about excitement, it wasn't about adventure, it wasn't about glory. It was about slow, quiet endurance. The poetry of effort, the meditative march of ink across paper, the subtle collapse into moral contemplation. And that, my friends, is why if you were plopped into that world, with your modern habits, your Netflix, your snacks, and your slightly flexible attention span, you would not survive. Not for a single day. Not even a morning.
We've seen the exams, the failures, the bureaucratic purgatory, and the occasional hermit poet who walked away with dignity. But there's a deeper layer that is less often spoken about. The gentle emotional collapse. The quiet, almost imperceptible meltdowns that defined so many lives of devoted study. Childhood dreams meet adult reality. Remember our scholar in part 1? The young boy who memorized classical texts until his eyes ached? He once dreamed of honor, prestige, maybe even a little recognition from the emperor himself. But here's the thing about ancient Chinese exams.
They have this habit of teaching you patience for decades, while slowly eroding hope. By the time many scholars reached their 30s, 40s, or 50s, they were still trying, still hoping, still writing essays that probably would never be read by anyone of significance. Some scholars handled it gracefully. Some wrote beautifully melancholic poetry. Some quietly withdrew into gardens and tea rituals. Others had tiny, private emotional implosions. The scholar who wept over ink. There's a documented story of a scholar, let's call him Mr. Lee, who after failing his provincial exam for the third time, sat alone at his desk. He opened his inkstone, he dipped his brush, he tried to write the opening sentence of an essay on filial piety. And then quietly, slowly, he began to cry. Not dramatically, not loudly, just little tears dripping onto the page. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was crying over moral cultivation and proper behavior while failing utterly at the practical task of securing his livelihood. After a while, he composed himself. He wrote a line in his essay, "The heart of man is weak, but ink can endure." And he continued writing. This, my friends, is the gentle emotional collapse of a scholar. Subtle, dignified, slightly tragic, and perfectly poetic. The pressure of family expectations. We've touched on family before, but it's worth floating back to this river of obligation. In ancient China, family reputation was everything. A scholar's success or failure reflected not just on him, but on parents, siblings, and extended relatives. Imagine a man in his 30s. He has devoted his life to exams. He has failed again. His parents are aging. His younger siblings are quietly successful in other careers. Neighbors gossip. Cousins' children ask, "When will uncle pass?" This was subtle psychological pressure, constant and soft, like a damped breeze seeping through the walls. Some scholars tried to soothe themselves with poetry. Others drowned it in tea. Some attempted humor, writing in a letter, "Dear Mother, the Empire still refuses to acknowledge my brilliance. I assume this is a test of patience or divine amusement." The family might chuckle politely, they'd continue hoping, and the scholar would continue sighing into his scrolls. Romance, optional, usually painful. Ah, yes, love. Being a scholar rarely left much time or energy for romance. Yet, naturally, scholars were often expected to marry well. Marriage was practical. Strengthen family ties, ensure heirs, maintain social stability. Romance was optional, sometimes disastrous. Some scholars married women of extraordinary patience. Others married women who were quiet but observant, knowing exactly when to serve tea and when to ignore poetic sighs. In the rare cases where love blossomed, we've seen the exams, the failures, the bureaucratic purgatory, and the occasional hermit poet who walked away with dignity. But there's a deeper layer that is less often spoken about: the gentle, emotional collapse. The quiet, almost imperceptible meltdowns that defined so many lives of devoted study. Childhood dreams meet adult reality. Remember our scholar in part 1, the young boy who memorized classical texts until his eyes ached? He once dreamed of honor, prestige, maybe even a little recognition from the emperor himself. But here's the thing about ancient Chinese exams. They have this habit of teaching you patience for decades, while slowly eroding hope.
By the time many scholars reached their 30s, 40s, or 50s, they were still trying, still hoping, still writing essays that would probably never be read by anyone of significance. Some scholars handled it gracefully. Some wrote beautifully melancholic poetry. Some quietly withdrew into gardens and tea rituals. Others had tiny private emotional implosions. The scholar who wept over ink. There's a documented story of a scholar, let's call him Mr. Lee, who, after failing his provincial exam for the third time, sat alone at his desk. He opened his inkstone. He dipped his brush. He tried to write the opening sentence of an essay on filial piety. And then, quietly, slowly, he began to cry. Not dramatically, not loudly, just little tears dripping onto the page. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was crying over moral cultivation and proper behavior while failing utterly at the practical task of securing his livelihood. After a while, he composed himself. He wrote a line in his essay, "The heart of man is weak, but ink can endure." And he continued writing. This, my friends, is the gentle emotional collapse of a scholar. Subtle, dignified, slightly tragic, and perfectly poetic. The pressure of family expectations. We've touched on family before, but it's worth floating back to this river of obligation. In ancient China, family reputation was everything. A scholar's success or failure reflected not just on him, but on parents, siblings, and extended relatives. Imagine a man in his 30s. He has devoted his life to exams. He has failed again. His parents are aging. His younger siblings are quietly successful in other careers. Neighbors gossip. Cousins' children ask, "When will uncle pass?" This was subtle psychological pressure, constant and soft, like a damp breeze seeping through the walls. Some scholars tried to soothe themselves with poetry. Others drowned it in tea. Some attempted humor, writing in a letter, "Dear Mother, the Empire still refuses to acknowledge my brilliance. I assume this is a test of patience or divine amusement." The family might chuckle politely, they'd continue hoping, and the scholar would continue sighing into his scrolls. Romance. Optional, usually painful. Ah yes, love. Being a scholar rarely left much time or energy for romance. Yet, naturally, scholars were often expected to marry well. Marriage was practical. Strengthen family ties. Ensure heirs. Maintain social stability. Romance was optional, sometimes disastrous. Some scholars married women of extraordinary patience. Others married women who were quiet, but observant, knowing exactly when to serve tea and when to ignore poetic sighs. In the rare cases where love blossomed, it usually became another source of subtle melancholy. A scholar spends all night writing essays, the wife waits quietly. The scholar passes an exam, the wife celebrates, the scholar frets over the next one. Letters may be exchanged, verses written, soft, tragic longing described in carefully measured calligraphy. Romantic gestures were often expressed through poetry. Nothing less, nothing more. No dramatic declarations, just delicate, calculated expressions of affection buried beneath classical references. The scholar's garden, a place for quiet breakdown. We've mentioned gardens before, let's linger here a bit. The scholar garden was more than a place of aesthetic delight. It was a stage for private reflection, meditation, and mild despair.
A scholar might wander the paths at dusk, brush in hand, contemplating both nature and existential inertia. Stones represented moral challenges. Water represented impermanence. Bamboo represented resilience. But mostly, they represented gentle, quiet reminders of failure and futility. Some scholars wrote lines in their garden journals. Even the lotus blooms only for a season, yet I endure year after year, still failing exams. The garden was a soft cocoon for melancholy, a retreat from administrative duties and family pressure, yet a constant mirror reflecting one's inner state. Friendships among scholars. Comfort with subtle rivalry. Scholars did have friends, but friendships were complex. They shared tea, they exchanged poems, they visited each other's gardens. But underlying every gesture was a quiet comparison. Who wrote the better poem? Who memorized the classics more faithfully? Who passed the exam this time? Even in comfort, there was subtle judgment. Because we're about to drift into the least glamorous, least dramatic, and yet somehow most soul-flattening part of a scholar's life, the bureaucracy. Not the exciting bureaucracy, not the imperial edicts, not the dramatic plots whispered behind palace screens. No. We're talking about the everyday, mind-numbing administrative labyrinth where scholar officials spent, well, the majority of their conscious existence. Imagine being crowned with the honor of passing the imperial exams. Finally, gloriously, after decades of eye strain, and then immediately being handed a stack of reports, tax documents, grain tallies, and complaint scrolls large enough to physically tilt your spine. Because, congratulations, you've graduated from aspiring scholar to professional clerk with lifetime neck pain. Your new job? Staring at documents until your soul slips out. Most scholar officials started their careers in extremely unglamorous posts. Not Beijing, not the capital, not anywhere remotely interesting. You'd be shipped off to a small county you've never heard of, filled with people who haven't bathed regularly since your great-grandfather's generation, and you would manage things like whether the local pig tax is being paid, whether the grain stores have mold, whether the river is flooding again, whether Farmer Lou's son has been rude in public, a surprisingly common complaint, and who is fighting whom over property lines that haven't moved since the Bronze Age. And because this is ancient China, everything must be documented, by hand, with exquisite calligraphy, on scrolls that will be stored forever in archives that nobody will ever voluntarily enter. Imagine your inbox. Now imagine it, unironically, being made of bamboo strips. Daily duties, the slow decline of idealism. Remember how scholars were taught lofty values like righteousness, loyalty, humility, and benevolent governance. Well, here's how that translated into daily life. Morning. Deal with villagers arguing over a duck. Midday. Read 40 identical petitions demanding repairs you can't approve. Afternoon. Inspect grain warehouses that smell like sadness and mildew. Evening, write 15 reports explaining why nothing got done. Night, cry softly into teacup. This step was unofficial but widely practiced. You were supposed to be the moral backbone of society, a model of Confucian virtue. And instead, you're making judgment calls like,
Is this chicken dispute worthy of a formal complaint, or should I pretend I didn't hear it? Seasonal fun, natural disasters ruining everything. Ancient China had a bit of a problem with natural disasters. Rivers flooded, droughts came, locusts visited like deeply unwelcome in-law relatives. And who handled the aftermath? You, the scholar with bad posture. Your responsibilities included attempting to convince farmers not to revolt, writing detailed disaster reports, assessing crop damage while ankle-deep in mud, filling out forms that documented other forms, and blaming everything on either heavenly displeasure or unexpected river behavior. It was never glamorous, no dramatic rescues, just trudging through knee-high water thinking, this was absolutely not in the Confucian classics. The art of saying nothing in 2,000 elegant characters. One of the peak skills of the scholar official was writing, but not beautiful poetry, not philosophical essays, not emotional reflections beneath the moon. No, you wrote reports. Reports so polished, so refined, so perfectly formatted that an emperor might briefly glance at the first 2 lines before tossing it aside forever. You mastered the ancient art of writing a long document that communicates absolutely nothing. It was a skill treasured by bureaucrats across dynasties. Saying something directly, rude. Unrefined, too straightforward. No, you danced around the topic. Due to circumstances influenced by both natural irregularities and local complexities, the outcomes originally anticipated did not fully manifest. Translation: the wheat died. Your worst enemy? Inspections. Ah, yes, inspections, the natural predator of scholar officials. Once in a while, a higher-level official would swoop into your county to assess your performance, which essentially meant judging your handwriting, counting your scrolls, asking why everything is 3 months behind, not accepting your perfectly reasonable excuse of, I desperately wanted to take a nap. And because ancient officials needed to appear competent, you would spend days beforehand doing frantic paperwork triage, organizing scrolls, copying reports, pretending things were filed properly, and sweeping dirt out of offices built entirely of dirt. By the time the inspection ended, you aged emotionally by several years. Social life. Mostly just trying not to offend anyone. You might think scholar officials had vibrant social circles, but no. Everyone was polite. Dangerously polite. Polite in a way that made every conversation feel like it could end in political sabotage. Dinner parties were tense. Tea gatherings were competitive. Poetry exchanges were blood sport. You had to be careful about tone, wording, facial expressions, who you sat next to, how loudly you chewed rice. Even your compliments had to be diplomatic. This poem is refreshingly modest. Translation: I hate your poem. You have captured rustic simplicity. Translation: you have no technique. This tea lacks ostentation. Translation: the tea is bad. Everyone was trying to maintain face. Everyone was silently comparing calligraphy styles. Everyone feared accidentally insulting someone's cousin's brother-in-law's patron. The slow creep of resignation. After a decade or two of service, most scholar officials had settled into a gentle, quiet resignation. Not bitterness, not despair, just acceptance. Acceptance that bureaucracy was eternal. Acceptance that paperwork was infinite. Acceptance that the emperor would never learn your name. Acceptance that your greatest achievement might be reorganizing a grain archive without suffering a back injury. Some wrote poetry at night, but even their poetry grew soft, nostalgic, faintly exhausted. Verses like, "The lotus blooms, unaware of careers, and the river runs on, unbothered by reports." Which is basically ancient speak for, "I'm tired, man, but the scenery is nice." Why this would break you in 24 hours? Let's be honest. Most modern people would crumble before lunchtime. You'd walk into the county office, see the mountain of documents, and immediately contemplate faking your own death and becoming a wandering flute musician. You'd sit through one tea gathering and accidentally offend 6 people with your informal posture. You'd write your first report and discover your hand cramps after 5 minutes. You'd inspect your first grain warehouse and immediately Google symptoms of existential dread. You'd handle one village dispute and wonder if becoming a hermit is tax deductible? The ancient scholar official lived in a serene but suffocating world. Quiet. Orderly. Beautiful in theory. Deeply exhausting in practice. And yet they endured. Because that's what scholar officials did. They showed up. They wrote reports about rice. They drank tea very carefully, and they pretended everything was fine. We're floating now into the life chapter that every scholar dreamed of, and every scholar eventually regretted: promotion. In theory, rising up the hierarchy should have been wonderful, a validation of decades of suffering, a reward for memorizing hundreds of thousands of characters, a sign that heaven had finally acknowledged your moral worthiness. In practice, promotion usually meant more paperwork, more expectations, more anxiety, more people who politely wanted to ruin your life. Let's drift into that very gentle chaos. The first signs of success. A scholar official might start with a modest county job. Then one day, a courier arrives with a lacquered envelope, the official notice of promotion. Inside, a beautifully written, perfectly stamped mandate. Your new role, your new salary, your new responsibilities. The scholar reads it. He blinks. He breathes. He sips tea slowly. And then he realizes he is now responsible for significantly more problems. Instead of one county yelling about grain shortages, now 3 counties will do it. Instead of one warehouse full of moldy rice, there are 4. Instead of 10 scrolls a day, there are 60. It's the classical Chinese equivalent of getting a raise at work that doubles your emails. Welcome to the prefecture. It's the same, just worse. As a prefectural official, you had more villagers, more disputes, more paperwork, more inspections, and more opportunities to accidentally offend someone important. You also had more couriers showing up at your door unannounced, carrying messages that always began with urgent request from the capital, which meant this will ruin your evening. Promoted scholars now had to draft responses to situations like crop failures, border disputes, epidemics, mysterious tax discrepancies, villagers who claimed their neighbors stole wind from their property, requests for more ink brushes, reports that requested reports explaining previous reports. Somewhere between the fifth and seventh crisis of the week, the scholar realized he missed his old life, the boring old county job where only 2 people hated him instead of 20. The politics. Polite, quiet, and absolutely terrifying. As scholar officials moved up the hierarchy, they entered a new arena, the world of very polite sabotage. No one yelled, no one insulted, no one plotted loudly. Everything happened gently, softly, with perfect calligraphy. Maybe a colleague subtly questioned your interpretation of a Confucian passage. Maybe your report was criticized for being overly enthusiastic, which was code for, "We're thinking about demoting you." Maybe someone suggested your handwriting lacked emotional balance. A devastating insult, believe it or not. In the higher ranks, political attacks were so subtle that scholars sometimes weren't sure whether they were being complimented or warned. A superior might smile warmly, pour you tea, and say, "You have great potential. It would be wise to not rush." Translation: "Stay in your place, or I will ruin you." Another might say, "Your dedication to order is admirable." Translation: "You're boring, and we don't trust you with real decisions." The political world was basically a chess game played by people who pretended they weren't playing chess. More staff, more problems. Promotion meant you now had subordinates, assistants, clerks, junior officials, which sounds helpful until you realize they were underpaid, overworked, tired, occasionally resentful, and sometimes corrupt in ways so subtle even you couldn't detect them. You had to supervise everything: accounting, warehouse logs, tax registers, construction projects, border patrol schedules, rice distribution, public works repairs, festival planning, administrative rituals, calligraphy standards. Yes, even that. And if anything at all went wrong, it was your fault. Bridge collapses, your fault. Crop failure, somehow still your fault. Villagers complain, your fault. Fire in the marketplace, definitely your fault. Earthquake, not officially your fault, but someone will imply that your moral virtue wasn't strong enough to prevent it. The emperor's gaze, terrifying, even when indirect. As scholar officials rose higher, their work occasionally reached the capital, not directly to the emperor, he had better things to do than read about moldy rice, but to people who reported to people who reported to him. This was still terrifying. A single poorly phrased sentence could land you in trouble. A single ambitious rival could frame your neutral wording as improper sincerity or excessive enthusiasm. And if you were too competent, that was dangerous too, because someone might think, he's rising too fast. And that could end a career faster than a drought. The safest strategy was be competent enough to seem useful, but not competent enough to seem threatening. Write beautifully, but never too passionately. Make decisions, but always blame someone else if they go wrong. And just float. Floating was an essential political skill. Travel, the soft misery of long distances. Higher-ranking officials had to travel more. And travel in ancient China was not the serene, meditative journey depicted in paintings. It was muddy, bumpy, uncomfortable, slow, mosquito-filled, and spiritually draining. Roads were uneven, bridges were questionable, weather was uncooperative, your entourage was always exhausted, and innkeepers were often suspicious of officials because officials meant inspections, and inspections meant fines. By the time you arrived at your destination, you looked like someone who had just survived a minor natural disaster. The curse of being known. The higher your rank, the more people suddenly recognized you, not because they admired you, but because they wanted something. Villagers wanted tax reductions, road repairs, grain distributions, someone arrested, someone released, someone scolded, or just someone to listen to them yell for a solid hour. Village elites wanted favors, alliances, shared connections, your support in disputes, or signature on something they definitely should not be asking about. And rivals wanted to watch you crack, to catch your mistakes, to quietly send complaints about you to the capital. Being known was exhausting. Being unknown was dangerous. There was no ideal balance. The soft heartbreak of ambition. The saddest part came after years or decades of slow promotion, losing the dream. Many scholar officials entered the system believing they would change the empire, bring justice, implement wise policies, uphold Confucian ideals, impress the emperor, or at least fix one village's drainage system. Instead, they discovered paperwork never ends, politics is eternal, reforms get blocked, good ideas get ignored, enemies appear without explanation, and ambition slowly dissolves into gentle resignation. By the time a scholar reached his 50s or 60s, he might sit beneath a veranda, drinking warm tea, realizing all those decades of effort had led to a life of endless tasks. He might sigh, write a poem, stare at a willow tree, and contemplate how much easier life might have been as a fisherman. Why you wouldn't survive this level either. Let's be honest. Promotion would destroy you. Within a day, you'd panic over the sheer volume of documents, offend someone important without knowing how, misunderstand a politely threatening compliment, lose track of your clerks, accidentally approve something you didn't read, get dragged into a feud over river boundary maintenance, and spend the evening lying awake wondering why your calligraphy lacked restraint. You would not last. Not physically, not emotionally, not spiritually. Scholar official life at higher levels was a serene nightmare, quiet, elegant, and endlessly stressful. And yet they endured it, softly, patiently, with the emotional stamina of people who survived decades of exams,